Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation, the podcast that explores the reality of a word in danger of losing its meaning altogether. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Dr. Merrick Furst on the show today. He is a distinguished professor and the director of the Center for Deliberate Innovation at Georgia Tech. In 2011, he founded Flashpoint, a first-of-its-kind deliberate innovation studio to develop formative leaders and exceptional technology startups. Dr. Furst, welcome to the show. Dr. Furst, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Hi, Jared. Thanks for having me. We've been talking for a little while, so I feel like I'm getting to know you a little bit.
Yeah, we're just glad that you were able to join us, and I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. Let's dive right in. What, in your mind, is innovation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Some people who have looked at our book think that part of what we're doing in the book is explaining the difference between invention and innovation. And I've done a lot of work with a lot of people around innovation, so I'll tell you the place I've come to. It goes something like this. Might be easier to think about it in terms of like, what does it mean to have a successful innovation? And successful innovation is when you or other people go about trying to make some change, hopefully for the better in the world, and that change actually takes hold. And you can contrast that with what usually happens, which is people set out to do something, they make a product or a service, or they raise some money, or they get some commitment from a company, and they do stuff, and then nothing really happens. There's not a lot of behavior change in the world. And then things kind of peter out when they either get tired of doing it or the money runs out. So successful innovation is the opposite of that.
Got it.
Successful innovation, when it really works, is you do something, you introduce it somehow, and then even if you walk away, and even if the original funding stops, it keeps going. I think that's what people are looking for when they're looking for successful innovation.
Got it. That's very helpful, and I love the framing around successful innovation. So the ability to walk away from something and have it continue to perform, continue to deliver value, to me, that implies a structure or a process. What underpins that? What's the difference between something that falls apart when you take your hands off of it versus something that can continue?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you've been doing this stuff for a long time yourself, so I kind of want to ask you that question too. But since you're having me, I'll like or sing for my supper or something. I'll tell you, there are a lot of things that can break the process of doing innovation so it doesn't work. Like you have a fight among the people that are doing the innovation, or some reason the money runs out, or the world changes. There are lots of things that are in the way. So the world is super noisy, and that probably accounts for a lot of stuff.
Right.
But what we've seen happen, though, that probably matters more, that you can actually get more control over, is when you make something or do something and the world is indifferent, then innovation doesn't succeed.
Indifference.
And it ties to something that it's taken us a while, or taken me a while to get my head around, about what makes someone a customer in general. And here's a useful way to think about it that we've developed. People find themselves in situations in which not buying is not okay, or in which not changing some behavior is not okay. That's kind of the requisite. Like if you have an idea for a product or a service or innovation, and the people you're doing that, let's say, for or with, they're in a situation in which not buying or not changing is actually okay, then you might be able to convince them to do it in the moment, but it's not actually how the world draws what you're doing into itself. And this actually ties to a phrase that I like very much. I won't tell it to you in the kind of religious way. The guy who described it is a guy named Fred Buechner, who was a religious leader. The place that people are called to is a place where their deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. And I think that's what innovators are trying to do. They're trying to do something that makes them glad to do it in such a way that others are glad that they did it. That is, they're hungry for it.
Right.
And when it's not working, or you're not getting success in innovation, it's either because the innovators themselves or the organization that's innovating is indifferent themselves to making something happen, or the world or their customers or whoever they're targeting are indifferent to what they're making. So that they may care, but there's no hunger, or there may be hunger, but they don't care. So the puzzle for innovation, the thing that seems to get in the way of most innovation, is that people can't find their way to that spot as innovators.
Hmm. Do you think they can't find the spot or they're not even looking for it?
Well, I think they're looking for it because that's, I think, what the draw is very often.
Hmm. I see. Okay. Yep. Yep.
Well, here's our experience, and this is what brought me to think about these things. If you work with innovators and you listen to them, a lot of times what you start to wonder is like they're living in some kind of waking dream. They've convinced themselves that if only they made this, if only they delivered this, that the world would change. And with the kind of resources and engineering talent and money we have available, expertise we have available, people can make stuff. They can make almost anything they dream of.
Hmm.
And then when they make it, and it turns out that people were indifferent to it, that's what a lot of failure looks like. And how does that happen? It's because people are very good at imagining other people demanding something or wanting something or reaching for something, but they're not so good at noticing that that's a fantasy. And so a lot of failure happens that way.
That makes a lot of sense. I love that term indifference because it doesn't even have to be antagonistic for an innovation to fail.
Mm,
Just indifference. You don't have to make people angry. You don't have to upset them. That indifference is probably worse than anger because at least anger gets you more attention.
yes, I very much agree with you. And most people don't get there so fast. I really like that. There's a phrase that goes like, what's the opposite of love? It's not hate. The opposite of love is indifference.
Hmm.
What the killer is you really can't live with indifference. But most of what you experience is indifference,
Hmm.
which is probably a good thing, by the way, because it comes from the fact that everybody is really expert at their own lives. And the idea that you might come along and say, I can show you, you're already expert at your life, but I think you should use this right here. And you say, well, wait a minute, I'm already expert at my life. I'm already okay. What are you bothering me for? That's why you meet indifference. And that's part of the reason that it's so difficult and takes either a certain kind of mind or a certain kind of process to identify situations in which people will be the opposite of indifferent,
Mm.
which people mistakenly think is like they have to have something or they need something or they're delighted by something. Actually, I don't think that's right. I think it's simpler. It's actually the opposite of indifference is non-indifference.
Hmm.
And there are all sorts of non-indifferences. They could reach for it. They could kick it.
Right. Right.
The mere fact that it elicits something, and there's a principle that we've developed around this. We call it the not principle. It's really helpful. If not buying or not using it is okay, well, then it's okay.
Right.
They can be indifferent.
Right.
So what you're really looking for is this not buying is not okay.
Mm.
So all the other paths, that's what's really interesting to pay attention to is don't tell me why someone should do something. Lots of reasons they should do things. They don't do any of those.
Right.
Explain to me how not doing something is not okay. And that is the key insight to what we call authentic demand, or what we've learned to call authentic demand.
Mm.
And that's the thing that innovators, when they can pay attention to that, we're finding that they're able to be more successful.
That makes so much sense. And as you were talking about the opposite of indifference, my mind was going to the word engagement. So whether you kick it or hug it or throw it down a flight of stairs or whatever, some form of engagement with it gives you some amount of information. At least in my years of doing innovation work directly on products,
Mm-hmm.
indifference or a lack of information was what killed things because you just stalled.
Yeah. This is a kind of being stuck. And I think it works on both sides. So innovators get stuck because they discover that the world is indifferent to what they're doing.
Right.
But what they're not noticing is their customers are stuck and you don't see how they're stuck yet. And once you see how they're stuck, which they can't necessarily see themselves, but they're stuck, then your product or service gets them unstuck.
Mm.
And I find that very interesting. It's a different way of looking at what you're doing with customers
Got it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
or with beneficiaries of the kind of innovation that you're doing.
Yes. I think some of the well-intentioned multi-million-dollar, sometimes billion-dollar development programs that are labeled as innovation programs that run into this indifference after 3 years, 5 years, 10 years of development. To me, I find that it's often internal stories we've told ourselves
Mm-hmm. Yes.
that kind of cut you off from the reality of the consumer's world.
Yes. Right. I'm convinced you're right. The work that we did, we sort of fell into was working with founders of startups, but also now working with individuals and trying to get unstuck in their own personal lives, or working with corporations that have innovation goals, try to understand the following question. This was like the intellectual bet I made, which turned into a financial bet, which turns into what I think has now become my life, is you watch people trying to do innovations, and what people are not noticing is that they're operating in a blind spot. And it's not a blind spot of their own making, it's a blind spot of the fact that they're human beings. And over the last 30 years or so, there's been this incredible breakthrough in psychology that people like Dan Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for in economics, to discover that human beings in situations of uncertainty make errors in judgment. And there's a collection of ways that those errors happen. But the thing about these errors in judgment is because they are judgment errors, they're not like calculational errors, they're judgment errors. People judge themselves to be right. And the difficulty with judging yourself to be right is when you're wrong, it actually feels like you're right. And so it doesn't occur to you to check.
Yes.
And so if you tell yourself a story about why someone will buy something, for example, there are lots of ways that you feel like you're right, but then you don't realize you have to check, but you check in a way that's sort of problematic. Like, here's an example that happens very typically for us. Someone will say, I want to make this thing, and this is who will buy it. And I'll say, okay, well, what makes you think they're going to buy it? And they say, well, it'll save them a lot of money. I'll say, okay, so why do you think that will be something that they buy? They say, well, I went to them and I showed them what I was doing, and I told them it would save a lot of money, and they said they wanted it. And so people sort of construct their world in such a way that they can't get no answers, because I typically would say to such a person, well, let me ask you a question. Could they have said no? And I can see a smart person will say, well, let's see, I just asked them whether or not they wanted to save money, and who's going to say no to that?
Right. Right.
So then, in the old days when I was a little bit more less gentle about this stuff, when I was just learning about it, I would sometimes say to somebody, so let me ask you a question. You wanted to find out whether they wanted something that would save them money. Yes. Okay. So you went out to find that out. You asked somebody whether they wanted this product because it would save them money, and they said yes. And now we're sitting here and we're realizing you asked them a question to which the only possible answer was yes, and they said yes to you. So there's really no information in their yes.
No.
And then here's what I don't say anymore, but I once said this, or a couple of times said, so listen, I can save you a lot of time. If you just need to get a yes answer, look in a mirror and say yes to yourself. That's the same amount of information.
That's great.
So
that's great.
But the problem is when you're in it, it just feels right and true. As you were saying, that kind of short, coherent story creates a sense of confidence. And then it turns out the world is way more interesting and nuanced than can go on in your head.
Right.
And so your kind of view of it, we don't realize that we're in a blind spot. And so innovating in a blind spot is very hit or miss. It's very accidental. And a lot of what we've learned is how important it might be to worry more about that.
Yes.
And to put around yourself some guardrails, some mechanisms, some people who could help you see the world more clearly for how it is, so that what you're building might actually fit into the world that exists, as opposed to the world as you might imagine it to exist.
So well said. And it takes me back to a conversation I've had around education. And you just mentioned Kahneman. Amos Tversky was, his big collaborator.
Right.
And
Kahneman, Tversky, right?
All the work that they've done sits in this silo of this realm of what they do. And every now and then someone from the innovation world or someone from another silo will reach in and say, oh, this might be relevant. But do engineers study these types of things? Do they study Shakespeare? Do they read broadly? Do they read the classics anymore? And what are we missing out on from a humanity perspective as it relates to how we solve problems? The main reason I bring it up is because you said some people look at your book and say you're talking about innovation versus invention. The word innovation, I think, is in danger of becoming a silo.
How so?
In that if people start looking at it as a freestanding discipline, it becomes a place where you can go and it gets the self-referential echo chamber kind of treatment that other things get.
Yeah. It's almost like you're saying Innovation is something that is a horizontal activity.
Exactly.
And instead what you do is you say, over in that building over there, in that room, we do innovation.
Those are the innovators. They sit there.
Yeah, I think we do that. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sound right. I don't know what you do instead, but I agree with you. That doesn't sound right. But this thing you said about how we're educating people, I would say that was a slow process until it dawned on me to understand what probably the same place you're at now, but I wasn't always there. I started my life more on the mathematics and computation side. Now I've gotten so much more interested in people and psychology. And one of the things that's definitely true, if you look at how people are teaching STEM disciplines, there's this kind of implicit assumption that the value is in that STEM, is in the science technology, which leaves out the point that it only matters to the extent that it matters to people.
Right.
And the people that have been paying attention to what matters to people are the people in the humanities and in philosophy.
Yes.
And so you leave them out, and now you've left out all of this work that's been done to try to understand like what's meaningful for people.
Right.
Yeah, it seems problematic actually in a lot of ways.
And I wonder if the folks that were programming early versions of artificial intelligence, face recognition, things like that, the coders, I wonder if the coders studied the classics and philosophy and psychology and those sorts of things, if they might have paused to say,
I work at a university.
Yeah.
And as much as you and I might wish that, I'll tell you what I bet you'd hear them say. I have college loan debt, and I'm taking the classes that are the best chance of giving me a chance to have a high-paying job to pay it off afterwards.
That's exactly right.
Which is super problematic for society in general.
That's right.
And people are missing a lot, but it's really hard when you're young to know that. And it's probably hard later when you to do anything about it.
That's why I wonder about the role of curriculum development. I think that's where the breakdown is.
We could have a whole conversation about that.
Yes, I'm sure we could.
One of the things I innovated is, along my path of trying to figure out like how to innovate, was doing innovation and looking back at what worked and what didn't. One of the things I did is a long time ago when I first came to Georgia Tech as a professor. After being a professor out west at Berkeley, I came here. And I was also associate dean. One of the jobs I had was to be associate dean for all the undergraduate programs in computer science.
Wow.
And I helped to recreate how to do undergraduate curriculum with something called a threads model. There's probably more than we could do on this. But the idea of the threads model was very much attuned to what you're suggesting. And it went something like this. Very geeky for me. I thought in computers, parallel computers inside of a single chip, parallel programs running, they're called threads.
Oh.
So the name of this model I called threads, and the image I had was, okay, we have students coming into our courses, and they might take a course from me. The course I was teaching at the time was algorithms, which is a mathematics important thing about computer science. But people in that course, they're not just there to be like me and be interested in algorithms. They have some other place they're getting. Maybe they want to be like Steve Jobs and do something at Pixar. Maybe they wanted to do something in the security world. So I thought of each of these people like executing little threads through our curriculum, and they have a path that they're on, and they're trying to get something along the way from each of these pieces.
Right.
So I suggested we think of threads and ask students to say what their thread is. And so threads would be, for example, go down this thread. These are the classes that you ought to take if you're interested in doing things that would make systems secure.
Right.
This is the set of classes you would take if you were interested in doing things that have to do with people. So there's a people thread and a security thread. And the idea that we had was to say, to have a major, you have to have two threads. So if you sign up for the people thread and the security thread, that might create a person who feels like they can make secure systems that people can use, for example. Now, in the people thread, it wouldn't just be computer science classes. It would be psychology classes. You try to find out about how the human visual system works so you can understand why you're encoding things on the screen.
Right.
How the auditory system works, how memory works.
Right.
So I'm just saying I like what you're saying. I still think that our STEM schools are not paying enough attention to the classics. That I don't know how you get that in that curriculum, but I agree with you.
Yeah.
Those are the people who know something.
Yeah. I was so excited to hear you bring up Daniel Kahneman in an innovation conversation, because that sort of thinking, I think, is core to what we do as innovators, especially people who are product and service focused.
I'd really love to know if you share a little bit about how that played a role for you. The three things I know about that are, first of all, people who are innovating are succumbing to these judgment errors themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The people that they're innovating for are operating with these judgment errors. And that most people who study this professionally in the behavioral economics world seem to have come to the conclusion that you can tell people they're making these kind of cognitive errors or they have these kinds of biases, but actually they can't do anything about it because they're still people.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only other side of this I'll say is the people that are being quite effective at using these things are people that are being very manipulative. So the talented people at Facebook who understand all this stuff are doing it to make sure that you don't turn away from Facebook and they can sell you more stuff using their ads, which is not the same as making the world a better place as far as I can tell.
Right. Right. And for me, the way it comes up is I think we often try to change people when we should be trying to design systems.
Yeah. So I love it.
We want to change our outcome. And so let me tell this person how to think differently or convince this person. And I think if we understood more about behavioral economics and the science behind Kahneman and Tversky's work, we would put our efforts and energies into places that might drive better outcomes for more complex problems.
Right. And there are people who are doing it around the edges somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
The work that we did that's written up in the book somewhat, give our journey a little bit, was go all in on that and see what we could make happen and lessons learned and share that back. Like, why are these things interesting?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Well, I'm just excited. Your book, The Heart of Innovation, it speaks to a lot of the core elements of the way I view innovation. And it's just fun to chat with someone who sees the world sort of the same way that you do.
But you also have great experience, the stuff that you learned at P&G. I've spent a lot of time talking to folks about different corporations and corporate innovation centers. One group that comes closest to doing things, to my understanding, takes more of these things into account as a process, seems to me to be P&G.
Yeah.
It's a little bit narrow compared to, let's say, what a startup could do or what an individual could do. Like with P&G, if you have a group that just knows flat out that here's how many $15 bathroom cleaning products are going to be bought in supermarkets every year.
Right.
And now our innovation problem is to find a new one that'll fit into that space. Okay, that's a kind of innovation.
Right.
But you don't have to worry about the authentic demand so much because the authentic demand is for a $15 cleaning thing.
Right.
And it's a little bit narrower. When you're an individual, you can't really live like that because you can't say, I couldn't ever make something which was going to sit on a supermarket shelf that was going to be bought for $15. I have to say, okay, me, as I am, how can I become of value? And the world mostly has set us up to say, well, here's how you become of value. There's somebody out there that will pay you for your time in like hourly blocks.
Right. Right.
And they'll pay you and go become the thing that someone can hire, which is an incredibly limiting way to be a human being. As opposed to saying, well, how can I find a way that the world would have an authentic demand for something that I could be uniquely? And then how could I become that? And that strikes me as something that is really useful to do. And that's something I think we can start to help people do more.
Yeah. It's back to your comment about the deep gladness. We come into things thinking about being useful or utility that could drive value. And we are less predisposed to think about gladness and how the gladness meets the deep hunger.
Yeah. It's this utility thing, I think it really screws us up.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the things that people in the world that I have lived in, they say, well, you should make things that people want. That sounds so right, except that it's so wrong. It's so deeply wrong. It's so weirdly wrong. It's so obviously wrong, but it feels so right. So here's how to see that. Just think of something that you want that you don't buy. And then think of something else you want that you don't buy. There are way more things you want that you don't buy than there are things that you buy. So if someone makes something that you want, it's just more likely they've made one more thing you want that you don't buy. And then people say, well, let's fix that. Let's make it something they really want. Like even let's make it something they need. And I'm thinking, well, just think of all the things you need to do that you never do. So that doesn't solve it either. So it has to be something else. So this thing that you have to replace want, need, desire, all that stuff just goes away. If you start to say, well, let's just understand why not reaching for it is not okay. And that just opens up these other ways of thinking about people that I want to just say, try it. It's different. It's really useful.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. It really does. Yeah. Those are the things people say, things that people are being trained on right now inside companies and in accelerators and incubators all over the world. Utility focused mindset, things people want, things people need, all those other things.
Yeah. So if someone says to you, if you're thinking that someone's going to buy this because it'll save them money, here's a question that people don't think to ask. So I say, I'll do this for you. And you'll tell me, I say, well, will you buy it because it'll save you money? And you'll say, yeah, I want to save money. But here's what I'd like to say. Let's say I figure out it's going to save you $100.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I probably should say to you. Do you already have ways to save $100 that you're not doing? And I dare you to find me someone who can't find a way to already tell you and I have these other ways of doing it. I'm already not doing those. So if I come along to give you one more way to save $100, what's the chances you'll do this? That's what people are afraid to ask. They're so interested in being confirmed.
Yes.
They're not really interested in discovering that people are actually just fine without you yet. And that's what you should check on. But going back to something you said earlier, you said people trying to change people. I think there's two sides to that. One is, I don't know if it's true for you, but it's true for me. Every time I've wanted to change, I might actually hire a psychologist or somebody and pay a lot of money and work on it for 10 years, and I still haven't changed.
Right.
So it's just really hard for people to change.
Right.
What's way more interesting, actually, is to see how people already are and enable them to be themselves more.
Yeah.
So you can turn it around and say, I'm not going to change people. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find out who they already are, how they go about being themselves already, find out something that's in their way of being that more, and remove that restraint. That's how to get people unstuck. And this amazing thing happens. If you show up to somebody's life and you just are showing up as a person or a thing or a product, service, and what they experience as this is taking off a restraint of a direction I was already impelled to go. They just were impelled to go there already. So it's not like you're trying to convince them of anything. All you're doing is bringing them to be themselves.
Right. It's eliminating an obstacle or a barrier to what they're already motivated to.
And it could be a technical thing because now they can do something they couldn't do. And it's subtle. It's often subtle. But what's interesting is how hard it is for people to think that way. Like you can tell people that, but that's not the way we think. We think I'm going to convince them, like I'm going to explain it to them. The reason I haven't done it is they don't understand, or I have to make it more valuable. None of that's really what's going on.
Right.
What's going on is this other thing, which you're not seeing, which you probably don't even have a name for because you haven't spent enough time being around these people, thinking about them the right way. By the way, this framework, I worry, sometimes I have these conversations and people call me up an hour later and say, made a lot of sense. I have no idea what you just said. Could you remind me? And that's part of the reason for writing the book was giving some people a chance to hear the stories again.
Yeah.
And tease them apart. So I just say that was our motivation.
No, it's a great story and a great example to kind of make it a bit more concrete, because a lot of what you're describing, you have concrete examples for, but it's very easy for a conversation like this to get very ethereal and hypothetical and conceptual. And I appreciate that you're able to keep it conceptual but grounded.
If you want a concrete example of my own pain, quite a few years ago, some professors at Georgia Tech had this technology, professors and a student, they came and they said, we can find all these bots on the internet, which are these malware programs that control machines. And one of the things we think we can do is help deal with a fraud issue that eBay has. I had a friend who was the chief information security officer at eBay. And I called him up and I said, these guys want me to start a business with them. But before I do, I want to make sure they're customers. So he said, explain to me what you're doing. I said, well, they can tell when a bot comes to your site. They can tell you whether it's controlled by a human being or controlled by a bot. And that means that you won't be defrauded as much. And they ran around and figured out, well, if you could really do that and integrate it with our systems right, it would probably save us tens of millions of dollars a year. And he asked me how much it would cost. And I made up a number because that's what you do. I said $150,000.
Yeah.
And he said, go make it. And so I came back to Georgia Tech. We licensed the technology. We raised money from first-rate venture funds. I replaced myself as the CEO immediately. And we built this thing. And 6 months later, we showed it to them and they were perfectly indifferent.
Wow.
They never actually bought the product. Back then I would say, a board would say, well, what's wrong? And the product people would say, well, they've asked us to integrate it with this system. So we did that, but they're still indifferent. Or they asked us to change this pricing structure, and we did. It was indifferent. And so I'd say here, back then, they said to me that it would save them $40 million and it would cost $150,000. It said, go make it. And I thought that meant that they would buy it. Now I'm saying there is nothing in that interaction, nothing, that now I would say should indicate that there's any demand there at all.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
That's what's different for me. And
interesting.
And I think that's what we're all doing. Hearing stories like that, we're saying, well, obviously there's demand. The question I should have asked was, do you have other ways to save $40 million that you're not doing? And my guess they would have said, well, we can add a quarter to everybody's account and that would get us $40 million. We're not doing that. Right. So in the end, this was one more way to save $40 million they weren't doing. But I'll tell you what, when you're in it and you're convincing venture capitalists and you've hired people and you've built out product, it is not in your interest to actually see it, even though you want to see it.
Right, which is the hardest thing to see.
Right.
The things that are not in your interest to see.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. This has been an amazing conversation, Dr. Furst. And before I let you go, I just want to see if you have any advice for innovators that you'd like to share.
Well, I'd say, I hope if you get the book or borrow the book from somebody, that there's a lot of advice in there. That was our intent for writing the book, was because it's so hard to see these things and even hear them, but to make it available so you can hear the stories again. Maybe I'll give you two pieces of advice. The first it relates to the fact that we're all walking around in a waking dream. So the people that are going to write you checks and fund you, the people you work for, your customers, we all have this kind of waking dream version of the world. And what we're really trying to do is create something that will create behavior change for the better. And it's hard. And so one of the things we've learned to do is a cultural thing, which is we try to hold each other and ourselves in what we call unconditional positive regard. Mm-hmm. And the reason to hold you in unconditional positive regard is to recognize that people are trying to actually get someplace good. And if they're screwing up or you see some way that they're making a mistake, instead of trying to judge them for that, you might say, listen, I'm holding you in unconditional positive regard. I'm noticing something that maybe you're not noticing. And it could be that it's meaningless that I notice it, but I'm noticing it. So let me put it on the table for you so that you can decide whether it's something you want to pay attention to or not. So that already can be quite helpful for individuals or groups. And I just suggest that as one way to pay attention to the fact that a lot of what's in your way as an innovator is that you're not noticing that you're not noticing. And if you can start to find ways to notice, you have a chance to see things more clearly.
Oh, so great. So great. Thank you for sharing that and so many other insights. I've got so many notes and concepts and ideas. I can't wait to go apply it to the work I'm doing. And I'm sure our listeners feel the same.
Well, great. It's very nice to spend time with you, Jared. It's like the first time we've met and I'm already feeling like you're the man. I want to find out more about you and learn more about you.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me a chance to talk, but I wish I'd actually asked you more questions today because I think what you're doing is amazing.
Well, thank you.
I hope this podcast goes far and wide, and the things you're doing, things you told me about with DEI innovation and with setting up processes and projects that you can actually coach people to be better innovators. I'm looking forward to learning more and hearing more.
Oh, for sure. And thank you for saying that. And yes, you and I are in a mutual admiration society, so we'll grab lunch and trade stories.
The advantage of being in the same city.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Dr. Merrick Furst, author, The Heart of Innovation. Successful innovation is change that takes hold. Love it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care. Thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to get more insights from innovators across the world. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional content and conversation. I hope to see you there. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.